200 participants and probably over 300 leaders in sldp who have been involved in a practical way in building leadership capacity in Scotland. I think that's a good achievement. In phase 4, we've got 67 participants. Could be a wee bit more, could be a wee bit less. Officially, 67. We've got 16 local authorities, 14 teams, and very importantly, we've got 30 coaches who have been doing a brilliant job, and I'm sure you've appreciated that when we were doing the 360 and the feedback from the 360. What's it all about? Well, it's a response to Teaching Scotland's Future, or it's a contribution to the national response on Teaching Scotland's Future. It's about building leadership capacity. That was the very first recommendation in Graham Donaldson's report. Leadership, quality of teaching in the classroom, and I think that we've been making a contribution there. It's about team-based approaches to learning, to improvement locally, the local teams working together, and then working with other local authorities, and I think that it's been a bit groundbreaking in the way we've tried to look at the borders of local authorities as identification borders rather than barriers that are put up between one authority and another. So we'll strengthen the models of partnership. Again, a strong recommendation coming out of TSF. And we've offered, I think, challenging but rewarding CPD for senior leaders. I think that what I would describe it as is opportunities. The programme offers opportunities, and it's up to participants, to sponsors, to coaches, to make of the opportunities what you want. Sometimes it's hard. When you look at the competing pressures that you've got, it's hard still to keep a bit of time for yourselves to develop as lead learners. But it's absolutely crucial. All the research shows that that's something that needs to be done. So, what were we expecting from you? We expected you to look at your approaches to leadership through the 360, to engage in coaching conversations with the coach, and then to plan your next steps beyond that conversation about what you were going to do next. We wanted you to participate in a local team, to contribute to strategic thinking, to take what we called a wicked issue, a theme for strategic improvement, and to move it forward. So that once you made your recommendations to the local authority, it would manifest itself in an improvement plan, it would be known about throughout the local authority, and it would have an impact on the experience of the children and young people in our care. We wanted you, where possible, to use research, and we offered you access to, for example, Andy Hargreaves, Louise Hayward, some of our own number, and we got some super responses from ourselves, offering up insights about what we were doing. And also, we were hoping, and this is a hope that I continue to have, that senior leaders will participate in online learning, that will spend a bit of time sharing ideas. We're hoping, for example, that during the conference, if you've not already done so, that every one of your reports on your wicked issue will be lodged in our online community. And the link to our online community is on the front slide, we'll put it up later on. So, finally, it's about sharing our experiences, and that's what we're going to be doing over the 2 days. With regard to the wicked issue, you'll be doing that this afternoon, and I'll explain more about that after Graham speaks. That's what success will look like. You know, if you look through that, you'll say, I got right enough. Yep, we've done that. You'll recognise things there that your team has achieved. It's not a box with a ribbon on it. It's a process, a journey that we're going on. So there's maybe other things to be done. But you'll recognise there the successes that you've achieved, and it's important to celebrate them. Who better to celebrate them with than the man who set the whole thing running, Graham Donaldson. Graham, of course, led the inspectorate, senior chief inspector in Scotland, so knows schools, knows the system inside out. Internationally renowned, who's worked with OECD, doing very, very challenging work just now in improving, transforming the education system in Wales. And who better then to give us insights about leadership than our keynote speaker today, Professor Graham Donaldson.
Dan, thanks very much indeed, and thank you all for being here this morning to talk about something which I think the whole nature of the leadership programme and of the challenge facing leadership in Scottish education has stepped up a gear just in the last few weeks, and that came home to me through a couple of things that happened in that those last few weeks. First of all, I was at a session, the Goodison Group in Scotland. The Goodison Group brings together people from education, business and government. And the idea is it's a non-political forum within which ideas can be discussed. And they're going to be giving evidence to the OECD review team that are coming to Scotland next week. They held a seminar bringing together people from different areas that are part of Goodison to provide guidance on the input that what we made, Goodison ought to make to the OECD thing. And one of the most sobering contributions to that came from, I won't say who it is, but somebody who would be known to most people in this room, who's a very senior figure in business community and also in the arts community. And he said that in order to prepare for the session, he had Googled Curriculum for Excellence. And he said what he got was some factual stuff about what's happening, and then nothing but criticism. That what he was getting was, if he'd just simply gone from what he had Googled, he would take the view that Curriculum for Excellence was not working, was probably counterproductive in terms of Scottish school children. So that was pretty sobering in terms of where we think we are and where others might think we are, and how we're coming across in terms of what it is we're trying to do with the young people in Scotland to try to prepare them for the future. And then, of course, there was all the stuff that surrounded the Minister's speech at the Robert Owen Centre a couple of weeks ago, and I was present at the speech. I thought that she made a very balanced speech. She made a very powerful case for ensuring that we redouble our efforts and refocus on the whole business of the impact of disadvantage on children's learning. And the media, of course, in relation to that, ignored the broad thrust of what had been said and turned it into a very negative agenda. In fact, I heard one of the advantages of being retired, you listen to radio phone-ins. I listened to a radio phone-in on the morning, which actually not an advantage, got me very angry, because the BBC, the question they were asking is, who's to blame for falling standards in Scottish education? And that was in the back of the Minister's speech, and the headlines in the Herald, the Daily Record and so on. So I think we are, all of us who are engaged in trying to ensure that Scottish education, as it moves forward, is really going to serve the interests of our children as well as we possibly can. I think the leadership challenge in the course, particularly in the course of the next year, as we run up to the election next May, is going to be incredibly important. Because the atmosphere is going to be febrile, there'll be all sorts of cross currents happening, and the solidity, the solid bit of all of that, will be what's happening in our schools, what are our leaders saying to our teachers, what are our leaders saying to our parents, what's the view that's coming across in terms of giving confidence to the community, but also to the teaching profession, that the kind of broad direction in which we're trying to go in Scottish education is one that ought to be supported. So, right at the outset, I just want to emphasise very strongly that I think that this whole leadership agenda and the nature of those who are in important, vital leadership positions across the system, the role in terms of maintaining confidence and ensuring that we continue to improve what we're doing for the youngsters of Scotland without dramatic shifts of direction. I think that the role, and that's the role that everyone in this room plays, and your colleagues across Scotland play, has become more and more important and will be tested in the course of the next year, I suspect, in a way that it's never been tested before. I suspect we're in for, I think education may well be one of the key areas that will be a point of focus for the election debate, and therefore, without making a political point, I think it's important that from a professional point of view that we ensure that we are exercising our responsibilities in that process in terms of trying to give confidence that we are doing the best that we possibly can for Scotland's children. And then what I want to do to start with this morning, I want to do 2 or 3 things with you this morning. One is to start, and that's to remind us why curriculum for excellence in all its forms is so important, why it matters, and why it's also fragile in terms of whether or not it will realise its potential for young people. And then I want to say a bit about turning back to the policy. Just think again about how do you ensure that in every school and every classroom, for every young person, that they are getting the kind of high-quality education which they are entitled to and which we want to ensure that they receive. Now, if you're sitting in Hollywood and getting conflicting views about how well things are going, what is it that should happen in order to try and make sure that the aspirations which are embedded in the agenda, which are broadly shared, still broadly shared, I think, across Scotland, including across the political parties, that those actually are realising the benefits for Scottish children, which they must realise at the end of the day. Remember, curriculum for excellence is about better learning and higher standards. If curriculum for excellence does not deliver better learning and higher standards, curriculum for excellence has failed Scottish children. And that's our job to make sure it leads to better learning and higher standards. So I want to say a little bit about that context, and then go back again and look at some of the implications that has for leadership, and to do that by picking up on what Dan said, the work that I've been doing recently in Wales and also work in Sweden. There are some interesting messages that come through about, and risks and dangers that come through, about how easy it is for apparently successful education systems to go from one end of the spectrum to the other in terms of success and confidence in the education system within a very, very short period of time. And think about that in terms of the implications for leadership. The drivers that are around us now are well known to us, and I'm not going to labour that. We may regard it as a mixed blessing, but school education, which at one time was a relatively insignificant part of the government agenda. It was significant in the sense it was the job of the government to deliver schools and teachers. But what happened inside those schools, what those teachers did, really wasn't the government's business. And that was true in countries across the world. It was largely down to the teachers to determine what was done. And the context of what happened in schools was largely driven, secondary schools, by the examination system, and both primary and secondary by the publishers. So we had a curriculum that was largely driven by publishers and by the examination system, but teachers had a lot of freedom within that to do what they wanted. Well, that's no longer the case. Government somewhere in the mid to second half of the last century discovered education, and from in UK terms, the break point is allegedly Callaghan's Ruskin College speech in 1976, when essentially he said education is too important to leave to the professionals. We need to get involved, the public needs to get involved, politicians need to get involved, and we've seen from that period on, in the 40 or 50 years since then, we have seen a very, very dramatic increase in the interests of politicians in what's happening inside our schools. And that has coincided in the latter part with from about 2000 onwards, with bodies like the OECD becoming dramatically involved in education. PISA has become a very key driver in terms of education policy in countries across the world. Many countries have had the so-called PISA shock. Countries that thought they were doing very well, countries particularly that spent a lot of money on education, and they thought there was a direct correlation between how much they were spending on education and the quality of their education system, got a terrible shock in terms of suddenly discovering that in terms of their relative standing in relation to what PISA measures, they weren't anything like as good as they thought they were. Countries like Denmark, for example, which had a very high per capita spend on education, got a real shock from the early as a result. They were far from alone in that. So we've got a driver that is to do with that whole context of education being seen as increasingly important, and the evidence about how relatively successful different education systems are in different countries is becoming increasingly easy to identify, and the OECD are playing a stronger and stronger role in relation to that. Part of the reason they're here next week is because of the role that the OECD is playing in education. And underlying all that is a belief that, and it's why education is too important left to professionals according to governments, is that human capital, the nature of the skills, dispositions, knowledge of the population is absolutely central to social justice. It's actually central to the nature of the society that we live in, but also central to economic well-being. And all that's taking place against an unparalleled period of economic and social change. So that the world is changing at a pace that all of us have experienced, and none of us can actually, if we look forward, not very far into the future, none of us can predict what things are going to look like in 5, 10, 15 years from now, because of the way in which change is now taking place, both in society and in the wider economy, and a lot of that driven by technology. And Scotland's response to that is tied up partly in Curriculum for Excellence, but it's more than Curriculum for Excellence. We're actually in the middle of quite a major reform programme, which has the potential, and I use my words carefully, has the potential to be joined up, but wouldn't necessarily be joined up. I want to say a little bit about that. So we've got these drivers. This kind of summary, I'm not going to go into this because this is too detailed to go into detail. But there's all the impact of globalisation, which people talk about, say, oh yeah, globalisation. But actually you can see the impact of globalisation every day. Interestingly, we've moved from a period where manufacturing is broadly, manufacturing and production will chase the cheapest place to produce whatever the product is, allied to the ability to have a population that has the skills in order to be able to engage in that. And the nature of that is that we've seen the flow of manufacturing jobs, production jobs out of the UK generally. We may start to see them coming back if we end up as a kind of low-wage, low-skill economy. That actually it's quite cheap to do manufacturing here because the nature of what we do, the nature of our human capital is such that this country becomes quite attractive as a cheap labour country again, unless we have an education system and an approach to building the skills and capacity of young people that means that we compete increasingly with India and China in terms of the top end of what's required in terms of the skills of the 21st century workplace. Changing the society, we've got the paradox of we've never been wealthier, but the inequality issues are very stark. And quite apart from the ethical issues, you can't afford that kind of inequality. You just simply can't afford to be in a situation where significant sections of the population are not able to participate in the high-end part of the marketplace. So quite apart from the ethical questions, there's a very strict, very clear pragmatic question. We just cannot afford as a country not to have a population that the vast majority of which is highly skilled. Skill demand is changing. I'll illustrate that in a second. All of that taking place against a background internationally of nobody, or very few countries, can throw resources at the issue. So we need dramatic educational change in order that education remains relevant for a dramatically changing world. And we cannot do that by simply pouring more and more resources into the process. That is not available to us, and that therefore poses major challenges for political leadership, but major challenges for professional leadership as well. And the whole list of things, you can think of many more, I'm sure, of the kind of implications all of that has for what we do with the relatively short time that we have kids in schools. I mean, remember, we're talking about, at most, 3 to 16, 17, they're outside schools, statutory education, 5 to 16. All that time, 80% of it, they're outside school. So we're talking about what do we do with young people during that relatively short time, and that 20% of that short time, that we actually have them in terms of the nature of what we do inside our schools, that's going to enable our young people, when they move on to the next stage, into the senior phase, into tertiary education, into employment, into apprenticeships. What do we do with them in order to try to ensure that they are going to thrive, not just cope, but thrive in that kind of context, which is actually very hard to predict, and it's partly very hard to predict because of the impact of technology on all of our lives, and the nature of the workplace, and the nature of just how we live our lives. And schools cannot, King Canute like, say, well, everything else has changed, but we're going to stay the same. You know, the whole world's changing around about us, but we stay the same. That's not a tenable position, and that's part of the issue that faces, the political issue that faces governments, is traditionally, historically, again, it's true across the world, schools are fairly conservative. They're hard to shift, they're hard to change, and yet we're moving into an environment where schools can make themselves obsolete. Education system can make itself obsolete very quickly in the context of the changes that are taking place. Just quickly look at that graph. Only was up 2002, and the figures since then are quite stark. But if you look at the jobs that are rising dramatically, demand for skills rising dramatically, it's the non-routine analytical skills, non-routine interactive skills. So young people entering the workforce shouldn't be entering the workforce expecting to be able to deploy predictable skills in predictable situations. That what they acquire during their time at school has got to help them to be able to deal with the unexpected, to deploy their learning in ways that are not predictable. And if you think about quite a lot of what we do inside schools, the message that we give to young people is that their job is to find the answers to things that we already know the answers to. You know, so we know all the answers, and your job to find it out. We'll test whether you find it out or not. That's what the examination says. And we'll go further than that. We'll try and predict as a teacher, in terms of the examination, we'll try and spot the questions you're going to be asked. So what we'll do is try to work out what the exam paper is going to look like, and give you as predictable a context as we possibly can for you then to demonstrate your skills. Well, that kind of situation is not serving them well. Maybe serve them well until they get the qualifications. I've done it. Has done it. Time memorial. But are we moving into a context within which we are actually doing a disservice to young people? And sometimes, as we know from subsequent performance at university, youngsters who've been well coached for examinations suddenly struggle when they find themselves in a context within which they're expected to rely much more on their own resources. Well, that's there in spades just now. And at the same time, the jobs that are disappearing are arguably the kind of jobs that we've been pretty good at preparing people for. The sort of things that generally have been useful from a school point of view are the jobs that are disappearing. There's a book which was a bestseller, it sold well in the United States, called Average is Over, by a chap called Tyler Cowen. And it deals with this relationship between education or what people bring to the workplace and technology. And essentially the thesis that he is putting forward is that if what you're doing is acquiring the skills that means you're going to compete with technology, you're going to find it very hard in due course to get a job at all. or you will get in very low-skilled jobs. There'll still be lots of low-skilled jobs. There'll still be lots of jobs that have to do with personal services, hospitality industry, or even there they can be increasingly technical. But you know, by and large, a lot of those jobs, but the top-end jobs will just not be available if you're in competition with the machine. And the joke that he puts in a modern textile implies a man and a dog, the man to feed the dog, and the dog to keep the man away from the machines. At the end of the day, we've got to recognise that there will be lots and lots of things that previously were done by people that will now be done by machines. And therefore, the skills you need to have are the skills that allow you to use the technology in order to do something else. The added value is your ability to use technology in order to go beyond what it is the machine can do on its own. And then we get the sobering stuff from the OECD. In terms of a report they produced back in 2008, essentially looking again across the world, across the OECD countries, they talk about a school system that's locked, in their case, somewhere in the early 20th century, let alone the 21st century. And it's certainly true that the nature of schools, what schools looked like, broadly, when I started teaching back in 1970, and what schools look like today are not all that dissimilar. That across a 40-year career, you know, by and large, you can feel comfortable in a context that you entered at the point at which you qualified. I think there's not a cat and hell's chance that somebody who's entering the school system just now, 40 years from now, will recognise. Will feel that they recognise the context that they were entering into at the present day. I think we're on the cusp of something quite dramatic in terms of learning and teaching, the nature of learning, the way in which young people can access learning. One of the tests that I suggested sometimes that we should use in inspection, particularly in secondary schools, was to go and look at the news agent's window and see how many adverts there were for tutors. That gives you a pretty good idea about the level of confidence the local population had in the school. The tutors now in Delhi, or the tutors in San Francisco, they can get access to high quality instruction anywhere in the world. You can Khan Academy, all this stuff, all over the place. So increasingly, young people are less and less dependent on the school they go to and the teacher they have for their learning. So what does that mean for what we do with them inside schools, if we still have schools? What is it that what does the 21st century teacher, what does the 21st century school need to look like if we're going to genuinely, as institutions and as individuals, thrive and continue to add value in a context in which a lot of the things that we've done traditionally actually are done better elsewhere. And interestingly, your tutor can be dead. You know, you can get access to the best instruction that there's ever been, and the person's dead because it's on the internet. So you get access to all of that stuff dead easily. So if you've got a teacher who's tired and worn out and can't be bothered, well, you don't need to bother about their line, you can get it elsewhere. So we need to think very carefully about, that's part of the thesis of Teaching Scotland's Future. Good teachers 20 years ago may be poor teachers 20 years from now. And therefore the kind of people that we need are the kind of people that can thrive in a context of change and want to be part of driving that change, want to be part of being in the driving seat rather than waiting to be driven. Governments have tried all sorts of stuff to influence what you do on a Wednesday morning with third years. What is it you do? How do they affect? How does somebody sitting in Victoria Key or sitting in Hollywood affect what a teacher does on a day-to-day basis? They believe that things have got to change, and they believe that the answers somehow are in the political debate, but they find it incredibly difficult to actually affect what happens on a day-to-day basis inside classrooms. And all sorts of things have been tried and are being tried. When I entered the profession, it was the package and push approach. That what you did was to say, well, we need to improve X. Therefore, what we do is to create a teaching package that will bring together the best way we can possibly deal with X, and we'll push it out there. Sometimes called spray and pray. You know,